Takes a minute. Okay, I think. Okay, I think we're live. Good morning, everyone. We hope you've had a great Labor Day weekend, and we are live this Tuesday morning, so thank you so much for joining us. I want to welcome everyone to the Label Our Beef Weeks of Action, and we have some friends on with us today from our National MCOOL Coalition, and this is a coalition of about a dozen members of organizations from around the country, consumers, agriculture, trade, all sorts of organizations. And we all gather together about bi-weekly, and we meet with Senate staffers, all in support of mandatory country of origin labeling. So it's a great chance for us to all bounce ideas off of each other, and we've got some great work done in those meetings. And so we don't want to take up too much of your time this morning. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Patty Lavera, who is a member of that coalition, and she is no stranger to country of origin labeling. And so she's going to moderate our live this morning. And so Patty, tell us about yourself and let's get started.
Great, thanks. Hey everybody, so I'm Patty Lavera. So I do policy work in DC for a group called Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment, which is some national groups. It's a coalition with some national groups and some state-based groups from the Midwest who are thinking a lot about animal agriculture and what we need to change, what rules we need to change for independent, family scale producers to have a fair chance to make it in these markets. And we got a long list of things that needs to change, but right at the top of it is letting producers convey to their consumers where their food is coming from. And a super critical tool for doing that would be country of origin labeling. And I have a long history on this because for years I worked for groups that also supported mandatory country of origin labeling. I worked at Public Citizen for a while. I worked at Food and Water Watch for a while. So I've been around talking about this issue for far too long because we shouldn't still be talking about it. We should have it. We used to have it and we want it back for beef in particular. So I'm happy to be here to talk about this and just have other partners who are also in this fight talk about it. So that's probably a good place to start. We might have one other partner joining us, but we're going to dive right in. So let me just go around and have the other groups who are here introduce themselves and talk about why their membership is really interested in getting mandatory COOL back for beef. And then we have a couple of questions we're going to dive into after that. So Bill, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm Bill Bullard with RCAF USA, and we too have been working on this issue for a long time. Worked with Patty to successfully get country of origin labeling passed back in 2002 in the Farm Bill at the time. And of course, the labeling bill covers a lot of commodities. It didn't just cover beef and pork. It covered lamb and chicken and goat meat and fresh fruits and vegetables and wild fish and farm-raised fish and shellfish and macadamia nuts and pecans and peanuts. And I may be ginseng, maybe missing something. And all of those other commodities are still subject to the mandatory country of origin labeling law. So consumers can go to the grocery store and see labels on those various commodities that inform them as to what country the product was produced under and under whose food safety regime that product was produced under. And so, as Patty said, the issue for us is we represent cattle producers. And without mandatory country of origin labeling, competition simply doesn't work because consumers cannot initiate a demand signal for a product that's produced exclusively in the United States. They're not given the choice at the marketplace. They're given whatever is on the shelf, and on the shelf, it's not labeled, or if it is labeled, could be improperly labeled, as we'll talk about later. So very important issue to us. It's how competition is supposed to begin in an industry. We don't have it. We must have it in order to provide opportunities for independent cattle producers to remain viable in the U.S. cattle industry.
Great. Thanks. Jordan, you want to talk about National Family Farm Coalition and COOL?
Yeah, good to see you all. Jordan Treakle with the National Family Farm Coalition. I'm play the role of National Programs Coordinator here in Washington, D.C. And NFFC is a farmer-led alliance of 31 grassroots and community-led groups representing the interests and rights of family farmers, ranchers, and fishermen in Washington, D.C. Since 1986. We primarily work on federal policy. We do a little bit of international work as well, and work on a lot of issues related to economic justice and fair prices for family scale farmers in particular. And as others have mentioned here, really since the founding of NFFC, critiquing the free trade agenda and the corporate capture of our food system has been really front and center in our work. And we see that directly related to the mandatory country of origin labeling issue that we have worked on and been supportive of for many years now. For our membership, MCOOL is important because it's about supporting fair prices for farmers and ranchers, making sure that their labor is compensated and making sure that those retail dollars are getting in the hands of those working folks in rural communities who are raising and slaughtering that beef. And we think that mechanism for labeling should not be restricted just to beef, but really should cut across all food, as Bill mentioned earlier. From a consumer perspective, because farmers are consumers too, our members feel really strongly that eaters deserve some basic market transparency to be able to choose where they spend their food dollars and the different environmental practices that may be behind those production systems, and really be able to invest in their local community and local food system. And then finally, through the COVID pandemic in particular, I think that we have all seen how fragile the hyper-consolidated meatpacking sector is. And we believe that this kind of market transparency, that mandatory country of labeling, helps to facilitate, is an important first step towards encouraging more healthy competition in the meatpacking sector and addressing corporate concentration in the livestock sector generally, and trying to have a more resilient and robust food system in general. So appreciate this conversation, and happy to be here.
Great, thanks. And welcome, Michael Nelson from Western Organization of Resource Councils. You want to take a second and say hi and talk about why work members really want mandatory COOL?
Absolutely, and apologies. I thought we were all going to hang out on on Facebook, and I didn't realize there was a Zoom link to get to. So apologies for running a little late. So hi everyone. My name is Michael Nelson. I'm the Washington D.C. representative for the Western Organization of Resource Councils. We are a coalition of 8 member groups across the Mountain West and Great Plains, and mandatory country of origin labeling is deeply important to our members for all the reasons that have been stated already: the fragility of the supply chain during the COVID-19 pandemic, the drying up of our rural towns back west. We definitely understand that the local farmers and ranchers are the lifeblood of our economies back home, and when they don't succeed, no one succeeds. So definitely MCOOL is definitely an issue that our members have been very dialed in on for several years now, and have been fighting for passage, and then fighting against the repeal, and now we're back at it again. So definitely, I think a lot of our members see this as a core part of the work that we're trying to do, and alongside all of our other initiatives of working on the Packers and Stockyards Act, working on regenerative agriculture work, but this is definitely a big part of it. So very excited to be here, very excited to work with these amazing ranchers back home. I'm from Montana originally, so it's great to bring this work here to the nation's capital. And yeah, I'll stop there, and let's get to some questions.
All right, great. Yeah, and so this has already come up, but just to reiterate, I mean, this is a coalition where folks at both ends of the food chain see this as an incredibly logical thing to do, right? So folks, raising animals or, other crops are proud of it, and they want you to know where it came from, and folks buying it. Consumers, when you talk to consumers about this, which I have done many, many, many times over the years working for groups whose members were primarily consumers, they actually can't believe they don't have it. When they got, when we got mandatory country of origin labeling for lots of foods, eventually after years of trying several farm bills, 2008, we finally got things rolling. People were like, duh, we always should have had this, right? We have this. I know where this pen was made. I know where my desk was made. Why don't I know this about something as important as food? And that's what makes it kind of heartbreaking that for beef, it was taken away. So mandatory country of origin labeling was repealed by Congress under pressure. Let's make very clear, under pressure from the big meat packers who do not like having to disclose this information because it affects a business model in which they can source either meat to be further processed or live animals at the cheapest point they can find it. But they would prefer not to convey that to consumers, and they would prefer for consumers to keep thinking it's all coming from here. So they're very content for consumers to be confused when they see a USDA inspection label that includes the letters US, and let consumers assume that meant not that USDA rules are being applied, but that the product came from the United States. They're quite content to let that confusion continue. They're quite content for their advertising and their marketing to really ride on the work, to free ride along the work of American producers, who really have a reputation for quality and all of these things. And they're happy to let people assume it's coming from closer to home, but they want the flexibility to source elsewhere where it's cheaper. And so they used global trade rules to get a judgment. We're not going to get into, we don't have enough time to get into the whole WTO thing, but they used the WTO, which was built for corporations to get rid of regulations they don't like. They used that process, and in the face of a decision which could have been addressed other ways, the US could have appealed and done other things, but in the face of that, and a lot of pressure and a lot of rhetoric from the meat packers, Congress did repeal mandatory country of origin labeling for beef. And that's why we're trying to get it back. And that's why we keep saying get it back, because we had it. We didn't have it for very long, but the time period where we did have it, it seemed like it was bringing not just information to consumers, it was bringing benefits to ranchers. So Bill, do you want to talk about that for just a minute, about for the window where we actually had mandatory COOL up and running? What was it looking like, in cattle markets, and how is that a driver to kind of bring this, bring this requirement back?
Yeah. So, and I need to clarify that actually everyone on this call was involved in the passage of the 2002 Farm Bill with country of origin labeling intact. So the window started in 2009. The bill was passed in 2002, but the meat packers aggressively fought the implementation of country of origin labeling for beef and pork. And so it was delayed from 2002 until early 2009. And then it was only partially implemented. It was implemented in a manner that allowed the meat packers to use a multi-country label. In fact, the label said product of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So consumers still couldn't differentiate between a exclusively domestic produced product versus a product that was in whole or in part imported from two other countries. And in 2013 is when the full country of origin labeling was implemented. And at that point, all meat had to be labeled as to where the animal from which it was derived was born, raised, and harvested. And that's why when you go to the grocery store today to buy chicken or lamb, it will say born, raised, and harvested in the United States. And if it was an imported product, it could say born in Canada, raised and harvested in the United States. So the consumer had accurate information as to whether the product was a foreign product or a product that was in whole or in part a foreign product, or a product that was exclusively produced by US cattle farmers and ranchers, or lamb producers, or poultry growers. And so what happened during that time is prior to 2009, US cattle producers were experiencing depressed prices, and their returns per bred cow were actually negative. And after the partial implementation in 2009, the returns per bred cow began to increase, and then they increased to the highest level in history in 2014 and in 15, But after the repeal of country of origin labeling, the returns had fallen back to a low level. And for the last 3 years, they've only been about $40 per bred cow per year. And so one can easily calculate what does that mean for the profitability of our independent cattle farmers and ranchers if their return is only $40 per calf. They're going to need a lot of calves to keep their operation viable. And this is happening at the same time that consumers are paying super inflated prices for beef. So it really makes no sense to the consumer. How can it be that beef prices are so high and yet cattle producers are being deprived of the competitive forces in a marketplace that should be allocating a competitive share to them at the beginning of the supply chain? And the reason is the system is broke, that consumers don't know whether they're buying beef produced in the United States or beef produced in any one of the 20 or so countries that we import beef from. Many consumers don't know that we're importing beef from Nicaragua, Honduras, Costa Rica, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Mexico. And that beef is on the grocery store counters and they don't know it. So this is a Truth in Labeling Act that we really need. And we need it so the market works properly. So consumers pay a reasonable price for their beef product. And so producers receive the opportunity to be profitable and to continue producing that protein product for consumers.
Great. So that's how we got here. That's why we're like this. It's been a long time, right? But we have an opening to get it back. We keep talking about that. So let's get into it. So let's talk about the bill that we have before us, the push we need to make. And that's why we were talking to everybody this morning to get more help, right? We need people to weigh in and say, it's ridiculous, we don't have it, and we want mandatory COOL. So I'll open this up to whoever, because everybody's working on it, but we do have bills in Congress that would do a very orderly process, and people can elaborate on that, to address our trade problem, which is fixable, very fixable, and get mandatory country of origin labeling back. So I'm sure there's links in the Facebook that you can follow, but we have in the Senate, we have S 2716, in the House, it's HR 7291, the American Beef Labeling Act. Those bills are alive right now. They are bipartisan, which is no small feat in today's age. It's a funny looking list, actually. If you look at the list of co-sponsors on these bills, you don't see lists like this a lot in Congress. In the House, we have the main sponsors from Texas, Representative Gooden, and then we have co-sponsors from California, Representative Khanna, Griffith from Virginia. We have a bigger list in the Senate. The bill's been introduced longer in the Senate. So we have senators from New York, New Jersey, New Mexico, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. That's not a list you see every day, which speaks to lots of people at different points in the food supply chain want this labeling, and that is showing up with who's supporting this bill already. And we think that's why we can get even more members of Congress to support it. So who wants to talk for a minute about kind of what the nuts and bolts of this bill would do? It would say, it sets a timeline, and it gives different parts of the government some jobs to do to figure out this trade problem so we can get this labeling back.
Maybe, Patty, I'll take a first stab at it and then hand it over to others for some more of the nuts and bolts. But I just wanted to underline again the grassroots nature of this advocacy push. I mean, Northern Plains Resource Council is a member group that we share, and coming out of Montana, who've really put in a lot of work in recent years in Montana to get this forward at the state level. And it's really encouraging to see this national coalition coming together with RCAF really playing a leadership role of work to get this on the federal agenda, and to bring this bipartisan group together that cuts across the aisle, because I think this is an issue that is not partisan, and there's not a lot of those issues, particularly in the food sector, that are not partisan in that way. I also just want to touch on where we are in the moment right now. Of we're heading into a farm bill session, and it's really important that our representatives, members of Congress, hear what are the big priorities coming from the grassroots and from our rural communities in the lead up to those negotiations. And as we get into 2023 and that process really kicks off, there's going to be a lot of issues on the table There's going to be a lot of priorities, and the pushback from industry is going to be really strong. So it's really important that folks get out and start talking to the members of Congress now about this bill and why it's important and how it touches on all these other livestock issues that Michael, mentioned earlier. And that this is just a first step. Like, we really want to see beef be prioritized on this issue of labeling, but that we shouldn't stop there. We should really make sure that that's extended to dairy, other meats, and that we have those statutory standards in place so that if, regardless of what administration is in power, that these protections and safeguards for ranchers are there. So I just wanted to sort of set that up in terms of the process, and then we'll turn it over to others to talk about the nuts and bolts of the bill itself.
Yeah, I think I would. So first of all, I would also highlight another local group in our coalition network. Dakota Resource Council has also been doing a lot of work to put pressure on their delegation. And yeah, the grassroots nature of this work is very important, and I think is essential to why the campaign has been so successful to build this bipartisan group of senators and representatives to get this over the finish line again, and hopefully it'll stick this time. Kind of getting in a little bit into nuts and bolts, how does this work? So it reinstates all the labor requirements that Bill kind of highlighted already that we've already had. And then the really big new thing is that it sets up a timeline by which the United States Trade Representative would need to negotiate with the World Trade Organization a new deal and figure out how do we be in good relationship with our trade partners? How do we make sure that we're treating all of our trade partners fairly in the marketplace, but also asserting a little bit of our right to know where our food comes from. So I think that something else that 2 points that I'll add to that are just sort of interesting and might be interesting to the folks watching this, where and this is actually something I learned from Bill, and I'd love to hear his take on this too. But the World Trade Organization is a very different entity than what it was several years ago. That, and with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, there's this really open question about what is the way that we interact with our trade partners when it comes to the tax credits for electric vehicles. And so there's some really interesting questions that are going to need to be asked. But I think that this bill, number one, gets us back all of the labor requirements that we so desperately need, and then also addresses the question of what's to do with the World Trade Organization, and delegates that power to the United States Trade Representative.
Yeah, Bill, do you have any further comments on that? Because that's I think the most common thing people hear is oh, didn't we try that and we lost it, and oh, too bad, right? But this is a way forward that is in this bill that we haven't had before.
That's exactly right. The World Trade Organization's anti-MCOOL ruling is the greatest impediment to restoring mandatory country of origin labeling for beef right now. But as Michael said, that entity, that international tribunal, is no longer the entity it was back when the country of origin labeling case was first filed, and that was over a decade ago. In fact, in the past 3 administrations, starting with the Obama administration refused to seat a panelist on the WTO dispute panel. And as a result, it hampered the ability of the WTO to function. Now, this was in recognition that the WTO was violating the trade laws that it was supposed to be enforcing, and it was overreaching, trying to impart its decision and its opinion into very important cases. And the country of origin labeling case is kind of the poster child there. But following the Obama administration, the Trump administration came in and refused to seat any panelists on the dispute resolution process. And as a result, the WTO was relegated to be kind of a economic or academic debate group. And now under the Biden administration, we started out the same way, that we still have a dysfunctional World Trade Organization with respect to its ability to continue imparting its own desires, if you will, in the decisions that it's supposed to be ruling on, to be fair. And so what Michael just mentioned too was the Inflation Reduction Act. Congress did something very different. Congress made clear that these trade rules are antiquated and no longer adequate to meet the needs of American governance. The country of origin labeling, for example, was passed under our U.S. Constitution. It was properly passed in a bipartisan way in Congress and signed by the president. And yet we had an international tribunal that was second guessing whether or not the United States even had that right. So in this Inflation Reduction Act, the United States essentially said, what's more important than following these antiquated WTO rules is that we accomplish the objectives of the United States of America. And so the effect of their new enactment was to deprive electric cars that are built in China from receiving a $7,500 tax credit when it is brought into the United States. And as a result of that, there's what's called a national treatment standard that the World Trade Organization was supposed to be following, that essentially said that imported products had to be treated identically to domestic products once it comes into the United States. Well, this is a departure from that. And so I think this is a signal that Congress is rethinking our overall trade policy. And Patty, as you mentioned, the World Trade Organization was largely established by corporate interests who knew that they would benefit from them, and they have. And now there's a sense that the grassroots people in the United States and elsewhere are not being given a fair shake, and there needs to be reforms. So I think the reforms have started, and I think the country of origin labeling, if brought before this particular WTO entity, I think the decision would be very, very different.
Yeah, it's a different time, right? Nothing else has stayed the same since 2015. We don't have to stay the same either and accept that there's no way people in this country deserve this information. When we get it for other parts of the economy, people in other parts of the world get it about their food, right? So it's time to take another look. And this bill is a very clear path forward with instructions about how to do it, which is pretty appealing for people like me that have been kind of beating our head against this wall for a long time. It's nice to see a plan. And I think that's why we can pick up momentum and why we are seeing folks from pretty different parts of the country, bipartisan, like we've been talking about. This does have a lot of potential because it just makes sense. So one other topic I thought maybe we could cover, and then we're going to rope people in to help us do this at the end. But one other topic we hear a lot, kind of the number one thing you hear is like, oh, with the lovely thought that you could know this about your food, but too bad the trade rules don't allow it, which we've just talked about is a myth that we need to knock down. And, we can find a way to do this. We should determine what we get to know about our food, and this is a way to do that. But the second thing you hear a lot is, well, a smart company would just tell you that. Can't the market do this itself, right? We have a lot of mythology about how our market works, that if consumers aren't getting this information, it's because they don't want it. That is not true. Consumers are not getting this information because the middlemen in the system, are blocking that information from being transmitted, either, voluntarily or, when we try to make it required, they've blocked it in the political arena. So there may be confusion out there about. So one is just the idea, if anybody has thoughts about why hasn't some savvy company just offered this up and become the market leader by being transparent. And then the second part of that question is people may have heard about something that's going on at the same time, and it does get a little bit confusing about product of the US and something that's happening at USDA to fix a legal definition of what can be labeled a product of the US. So it's a two-part question for maximum complexity there. So first part is, just why hasn't the market solved this themselves if consumers want it so badly? And then number two is like, what's going on with USDA with this rulemaking? Can't we just fix it there? Why do we need Congress? So anybody wants to dive into either part of that?
Well, I think to answer the first question, like why is the market not like automatically taking this to it's because it's deceptive. Like we talked about that earlier, where I think a lot of like consumers, I know that like before I got into this work, like I would go to the grocery store and I would see, the USDA label and I'd be like, oh, so it's US beef, great, lovely. And you don't think about it because you're making a quick decision. You got stuff to do. You have chores to do when you get home or whatever. And so I think that part of it is that this is not a transparent process, and it isn't easy for it isn't easy for consumers to know exactly where their beef is coming from. So I think they're assuming the best. And so that's one thing. And I think then on the other end, the huge cattle packer corporations like are incentivized to cut corners when they can. So they have no reason to, hold themselves to a higher standard if they don't have to.
Maybe just to build off of that, I mean, there is so much evidence from the livestock sector of those deceptive practices. There's a comment period within USDA right now looking at the tournament system in the poultry industry, and there's been so much evidence of the ways in which corporations have been colluding in that sector to not have to compete and not do the right thing in terms of paying farmers or being transparent to consumers. And so unfortunately, the evidence is stacked against these large corporations in terms of their willingness to do the right thing. But I think the importance of having a mandatory country or labeling that goes across the sector is about having one playing field where everybody has to compete with the same set of rules. And that's how you foster a healthy competition in the economy. And so everybody should have to abide by the same rule book. So that just seems like a pretty basic step. And I don't think that those companies that are doing the right thing shouldn't have to be at a competitive advantage to do something as basic as being transparent about their practices.
Yeah, and then the other thing that I get that question a lot when I talk about MCOOL is a lot of folks who think the market can magically fix this aren't aware of how big a couple of players are in this marketplace, right? That how much power 4 companies, maybe in your area, 3 companies, maybe 2 companies, just the assumption we all have because we were taught it about how markets work is that there is competition. And we all know, I imagine people coming to this chat have a lot of real life experience about the lack of competition in these markets, right? And we have big players controlling huge portions of the marketplace. They don't have to do much that they don't want to do, which then takes us to having to make rules and regulations, right? Because it's not happening because they don't need to compete with each other because we have passed a threshold, right, of having a functional marketplace, that'll be the next chat. We talk about what we're going to do about that. But this is a first step, right, to address one of the symptoms that happens in a market that's that consolidated. So Bill, can you talk a little bit about how getting mandatory MCOOL back by changing the law is different than what people are watching this kind of slow march at USDA to fix a bad definition of product in the US and how they're kind of parallel but different things that we need to do?
Right. So when the country of origin labeling bill was first passed, it was passed in statute, became the law of the land, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture was obligated to implement that statute. And while the statute was in place and the law was implemented by USDA, that's when we had the accurate labels where the animal had been born, raised, and harvested. But when the country of origin labeling law was repealed by Congress, another very important provision was repealed. And that was the provision that required all foreign beef, once it crosses U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the label on the beef was required to be retained through retail sale, meaning all the way to the grocery store. But when the law was repealed for beef, so too was that provision repealed. So we reverted back to the U.S. Department of Agriculture's administrative rules before they had the statute that guiding them. And in those administrative rules, the agency had decided that once a foreign product entered the U.S. Marketplace, it was deemed to be a domestic product. And so the USDA has been allowing meat packers to import beef from, say, Costa Rica. And they could take it out of the original package that had product of Costa Rica on it, throw the package away in a U.S. processing plant, and repackage it with a product of USA label. So today, under the slow U.S. Department of Agriculture administrative process, we have a huge deception going on where consumers are being informed that a product is of U.S. origin when in fact it is not. It may only be the plastic that is of U.S. origin, if even that. And so, effort by U.S. Department of Agriculture to correct that problem is a rulemaking process, but they don't have a statute requiring them to label all products. So they're focused only on what they have the authority to focus on, and that is the voluntary labeling of domestic product. And so Congress has watched the USDA for many years and decided that it needs to guide USDA in the rulemaking process. So it is attempting to pass a legislation that would ensure that only products that in which the animal had been born, raised, and harvested in the United States would ever be eligible for the product of USA label. But it won't cover any imported products. So consumers will still have the challenge of distinguishing between a US inspection sticker versus the origin label. And it's very narrow. It's only if the meat packer wants to label will that beef ever be labeled? And that's an important point. It's just the nature of the US cattle supply chain. It takes 18 months to 2 years approximately to bring an animal from birth to harvest. And during that time, the industry is segmented. So each producer will likely sell to the next segment. And of course, once they sell the animal, they have no control whatsoever over how the resultant meat product is going to be labeled. And that's why mandatory country of origin labeling is essential, because it would require everyone along the supply chain to maintain the integrity of the label for the benefit of the consumer.
Yeah, because you get a lot of questions just when you talk to people about Congress should do something. When you leave the Beltway, most people are like, are they gonna, right? Like, let's be clear about what people are thinking about Congress right now, right? So then if they hear, oh, the USDA is do something, is that a shorter path? One, at the rate USDA has been going, it doesn't seem like it's a shorter path. But two, what they are doing is valid and we need it done. It is not acceptable for this definition to have this giant loophole in it, but it is a definition for a voluntary decision to label. So yes, absolutely fix it. We need to keep pushing on that. They need to do a good job. It should have been done a long time ago. But even when that's done, it is not requiring companies to provide this information. And we're all living in a marketplace where these companies have not chosen to give us this information out of the goodness of their hearts, or because they think it's a good business practice. They have chosen not to, in large part, right? Which is why we are talking about why Congress has to intervene and by law require mandatory country of origin labeling, which is where you all come in. It's time for a big push, right? And we talked, Jordan and Michael, everybody talked about, this is a really important window to finish up this Congress with a really strong showing. And then as we ideally get it done this year, but even if we don't get it done this year, we always have another shot at it in a new Congress, especially in a new Congress next year that it has to write a farm bill. So finishing really, really strong and picking up a lot more support. And we show support for bills by adding co-sponsors, by members of Congress saying, I endorse this concept, I will co-sponsor this bill. So that's the push, is getting more and more members of Congress to endorse this bill by being a co-sponsor. And they do that when they hear from their constituents. That's pretty basic, but it's how it works. So that's what, we're really doing a big push right now. Summer's over, they're back to work, they're back in DC, and it's time to tell them, you expect them to endorse this bill. So Jaiden, I think you can talk people through some opportunities RCAF has set up, right? There's a couple different ways people can call, you can email, and I think you have a lot of links for people to do that, right?
Yes. So as I said at the beginning of this is our Label Our Beef Weeks of Action. And that's the whole MCOOL coalition is coming together on these weeks of action. And so one of the main ways we want to promote contacting your congressmen and senators and representative is on our labelourbeef.com. If you go on there, you will see a button that says MCOOL campaign, and it will direct you to an online form that if you fill out the needed information, it just takes about 5 seconds, and hit next, it automatically pulls your 2 senators and representative. And it has a pre-drafted message we've put together for y'all. And all you have to do is hit submit, and it automatically sends it to your 3 congressmen. And so it's super easy. It takes like 5 minutes. And it's pretty cool that it just automatically goes to their email, and really all you had to do was fill out a form. So we would appreciate y'all doing that. And then the other aspect of this weeks of action is on social media. You will notice on the RCAF page and the Label Our Beef Facebook page, which is called USA Beef, as well as all of our other social media platforms and the social media platforms of those coalition members. Everyone is going to be posting graphics and information regarding MCOOL. And so if you see any of those, if you would share, like, comment, whatever you feel like doing on those posts to help us spread this message and just get as much momentum and as much attention as we can on this issue and kind of help just push us over the finish line. The other thing of that is tell your friends and family, because this affects everybody. And so I think all of that together, those are simple steps that you can do and really help make a difference on this issue. So before we get off, does anybody else have anything to add before we jump off of here? No, I think we covered a lot of good stuff, and I think we're going to continue to cover a lot of good stuff over the next 2 weeks. And so I think that concludes our live here today. Thank you, Patty and Jordan and Michael and Bill, for joining us and being on with us this morning. And everybody have a great rest of your week. Okay, let me